Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, what do you think about anger and rage?
It depends tremendously on the context. It can be a terrible poison when it arises for selfish or malicious reasons, driving people to hurt themselves and others. But I also think it is the correct and appropriate response to injustice, part of what drives virtuous people to stand up to bullies and tyrants. What does the Buddha have to say about it?
Admittedly, not much. Texts written by his disciples later on in history discuss it, but they can't decide if it's a good righteous thing or an evil thing to be done away with. I think, like you, that it can go either way. I struggle, however, with knowing how to judge whether it is definitively good or bad in a Buddhist sense in a given situation, being unenlightened as I am. In other words, I don't have the foresight to know if the ends lead to harm or enlightenment for others.
I don't think any enlightened being has that foresight, and I think anyone claiming they do should be regarded skeptically. Anger is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for both good and ill. Used poorly, it's an evil state of mind that drives us to do harm. But if we strive to be morally perfect, like we perfect meditation, compassion, and wisdom, I think it can serve as a fueling, clarifying force. We can look to Fudo Myo and other wrathful protectors as examples.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing rage and anger in Buddhism. How ought we understand anger and rage in Buddhism? What are the different types of anger and rage in Buddhist thought? What is the role of anger and rage in Buddhism? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get started. How ought we understand anger and rage in Buddhism?
This is an important question because it touches on a very real, valid, and important emotional experience and state of mind that people feel on a daily basis. Anger has a unique and interesting place in Buddhism that can be positive or negative, like violence and social revolution from our previous episodes, links of which will be in the show notes. To make things even more interesting, there are also Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who represent and project anger and rage themselves. Their anger is regarded as holy, and worshipping these deities is worshipping their anger. In particular, we will consider Akala Vijayaraja, or Fudo Myo, the most famous, rageful, and furious Buddhist deity in the pantheon. So to begin, we'll discuss anger as an unwholesome thought, and then we will discuss it as a wholesome thought, and then we will consider the example of Akala Vijayaraja. Through that discussion, we'll hopefully show where anger and rage fit into Buddhist moralities and cosmologies. Let's begin at the beginning. In early Buddhism, anger or ill will is counted as a klesha, or a defilement, an unwholesome state of mind or an experience that gets in the way of the pursuit of the Buddhist path. Defilements are presented in metaphor as toxic plants that take root in the soil, aka your consciousness, and produce toxic fruits, which in turn poison your consciousness further. The roots of these defilements need to be removed by good practice and meditation. While the sutras themselves don't present lists of kleshas, they do reference the kleshas as obstacles to enlightenment. The Abhidharma texts dig into the topic in much more detail. Various texts present various lists, and it would be a waste of time at this stage to go over all of them, but many items on these lists are stuff we've talked about as being bad in Buddhism before. Examples include ignorance, pride, ill will, sloth, attachment, and stuff like that. Among the many klesha lists, several items that appear on them can be translated or interpreted as anger. The first item I'd like to mention is known in Sanskrit as dvesha, or as dosa in Pali. This has been translated as aversion or hate, and it's one of the 3 or 5 poisons. These 3 or 5 poisons are the root kleshas which lead to all other negative experiences in one's daily life. They are either ignorance, greed, and dvesha, or anger-hatred, or they are those 3 plus self-identity and attachment. The 5 poisons are more commonly found in Hinduism than in Buddhism. So dvesha is one of the 3 or 5 poisons, the root kleshas that lead to all others, and it's also one of the 14 unwholesome mental factors. It's defined as aversion or hatred toward another, and it obviously leads to bad behavior. In being a bad mental action, it generates craving, specifically the desire for the absence of that which you are averse to, and the behaviors that flow forth from that generate bad karma and lead to continued arising in samsara. Another klesha, different from dvesha, is known in Sanskrit as pratigya, or in Pali as patiga. This is defined as ill will or malice toward another. This is a step further than aversion, and it goes to hostility or aggression towards somebody or something. It functions as a basis for finding faults in everybody and everything, for negative actions, and for not finding any peace or happiness. According to other Abhidharma texts, it is one of the 6 root kleshas, and it's one of the 10 shackles or the 10 fetters that yoke us to samsara. It is sometimes synonymous with dvesha and sometimes regarded as a result of dvesha. We are working in the era of texts that try to organize and classify all human experiences, feelings, and emotions in the context of the continued arising of samsara, so there are many versions and many lists. In all cases, anger, aversion, and more are unwholesome states. So when does anger or rage become a wholesome state? We have the case of Akala Vijayaraja, or Fudomyo in Japanese, where rage and anger is attributed to this deity of worship. How does that make sense if anger and rage are unwholesome? Well, the answer comes from concepts that we've explored in Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. When we read the Vajrasekhara Sutra and when we have discussed esoteric Buddhism, we've brought up this issue of relativity and inclusivity, which go hand in hand in esoteric Buddhist thought. The relativity aspect speaks to the fact that distinctions like moral good and moral bad, wholesome and unwholesome, etc., are useless and meaningless distinctions that unenlightened beings put onto stuff because of the weight of their own individual experience that's rooted in ignorance. The reality is much more complicated. As an example, we talked about how death and illness are regarded as bad things, but they were the first sights that caused Shakyamuni to leave the palace and become the Buddha, so they're enlightening in that way. Rage and anger can be the same. Rage and anger are not unwholesome or bad when viewed as potentially enlightening or as fuel for one on the path of enlightenment. In other words, if you become angry about dukkha, and that leads you to a life as a monk where you seek to eradicate suffering, that is a very wholesome and meritorious trajectory. That's the key to inclusivity and relativity. Similarly, if your anger or rage is what is necessary to remove obstacles to enlightenment for those around you, that's no different from perfecting the bodhisattva ideal of metta or compassion. All potential paths to Buddhahood are explored because of inclusivity and validated because of relativity. Mahavairocana uses whatever tools he has at hand to lead beings to enlightenment, and that is why we went through exhaustive lists of objects given to him in the Vajrasekhara Sutra, including weapons like swords, spears, hooks, vajras, thunderbolts, tongues, laughter itself, flowers, etc. That brings us to a discussion of Akala Vijayaraja. He is a wrathful deity and a Dharmapala, meaning he is a rageful and angry protector of the Buddha's Dharma and Sangha. He is a Buddha himself, or otherwise an enlightened being, who uses his anger and rage to remove obstacles, attachments, and fetters to enlightenment. His skin is often depicted as blue, and the reason why is to convey how angry he is. My local monk describes that there are levels of anger and rage in Buddhism. At the regular human level, our faces get red, maybe our throats and chests as well if we're really raging. When enlightened beings get mad, their entire bodies can turn red. Incidentally, Amitabha is often depicted in pictures with red skin, especially in esoteric contexts, because he's understood to have anger or rage as a tool at his disposal as well. The next level above that is to get so angry that your body turns not only red, but blue, like when fire gets hot enough to turn from orange to blue. Sometimes Akala is also depicted as having black skin, which goes even one more step further than the blue skin in terms of levels of anger. He uses this anger to destroy and vaporize attachments, desires, ignorance, greed, and more in all of us. His rage is thought to have one or more of 3 specific effects on us. It's either supposed to empower us to enlightenment, to scare us into becoming enlightened or starting the path to becoming enlightened, or to make us afraid to act on any ill intent we may have had towards Buddhism, toward the Buddha, or toward the community of Buddhists. This protective function is seen as an ideal, and so it speaks to Vajrayana Buddhism beginning to encourage protection of the Dharma by angry or even violent means, because this is seen as righteous violence. That has led historically to standing monastic armies in China and Japan, as we have mentioned previously on our episode about martial arts.
What are the different types of anger and rage in Buddhist thought?
I think there are several ways to classify and categorize anger and rage in the Buddhist context. The first way I would like to discuss is doctrinal, enlightened versus unenlightened anger. One might think that enlightened anger is good and that unenlightened anger is bad, since enlightened beings would by definition never use anger to harmful ends, because they've perfected compassion toward all sentient beings. This implies any state of mind they project to sentient beings serves the purpose of enlightening them, not harming or killing them. On the other hand, one might think unenlightened beings would use anger to harmful ends because they, by definition, have no other choice. They're trapped by ignorance, karma, and samsara, and so all of their actions are ignorant, karmic, and samsaric. This is only partially true, and the reason why is that there is a second way to categorize anger. The second way I'd like to discuss is moral, anger toward a good end or anger toward a bad end. As I mentioned just now, anger by enlightened beings always necessarily leads to a morally good end, the enlightenment of others. But the anger of unenlightened beings can go either way. It can be toward a bad end, which leads to the harm of other sentient beings. But it can also be toward a good end, such as the enlightenment of oneself and others. The example I gave earlier, where one gets mad at dukkha, and that motivates them to enlightenment, is a good example of unenlightened anger used to a good end. The complicated part is that unenlightened beings, having incomplete knowledge of karma, have little to no way of judging or assessing whether the end is/was positive or not, because we're unenlightened. There's a similar problem with assessing whether somebody else is enlightened or not. I'm not enlightened, so how could I ever know for sure one way or the other if the person I'm talking to is enlightened? I would basically have to take their word for it, which can be dangerous. I'm not omniscient, and so I have little to no way of knowing if the anger I express or act upon enlightens anybody, and thus is able to be called righteous. A plausible metric to use would be the given Buddhist moral system, which, as we have discussed, typically measured morality by whether one's actions harmed another sentient being, or if they led to increased or decreased delusion, but that too is complicated by the changing moral systems in Buddhism throughout its history. The third way to categorize anger in Buddhism is historical and sectarian, anger in Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. In Theravada, it is universally regarded as bad. No Buddhas or Bodhisattvas have ever or would ever express anger, because they are regarded as having removed the roots of anger from themselves, and so it could never arise in them. This applies universally. Righteous anger is even thought of as harmful because it is still a result of strong desire for things to be a way that they are not, and its ill will towards something or someone. The labels of righteous or unrighteous don't really factor into the moral calculus because all anger is anger, and all anger is immoral. In Mahayana Buddhism, this starts to change, largely on the basis of whether something is righteous or not. Most of early Buddhist morality discourse is actually carried over into Mahayana in an unquestioning fashion, but the entire system of morality itself comes to be questioned as an effective means of reaching enlightenment and Buddhahood. Morality is wholesale categorized as being the difficult, long, and unreliable path to Buddhahood, even if it's still a valid one, whereas means that were understood to be more expedient towards enlightenment become favored. These include chanting, visualization, sutra recitation, and other rituals. Because morality is doubted or questioned on a grand scale, individual kleshas such as anger are not addressed directly. In other words, there are no sutras or commentaries in the Mahayana textual tradition that say, the Shravakas think anger is bad, but here's why it actually isn't. Later in Buddhism's history, in Vajrayana, anger becomes elevated and even worshipped in its context as being potentially enlightening. Harming sentient beings is never worshipped, but anger is not written off entirely. It's one of the 10 moral precepts not to be angry or hold thoughts of ill will, but because of relativity and inclusivity, we see much more of a mindset of ends justifying means, of all potential paths to Buddhahood being acknowledged and validated, and of the whole universe and every sentient being in it being bent toward enlightenment by default.
What is the role of anger and rage in Buddhism?
This is a complicated question. Anger is a human experience, but Buddhist thinkers have struggled with it at times because of the variety of outcomes that it has. It can lead to harm, delusion, ignorance, and attachment, but it can also lead to the removal of obstacles and the empowerment of people on the path to Buddhahood. In my view, it plays a similar role in Buddhism to its role in other religions. Comparisons are rarely productive, and we try to make that clear on this show by only making them to show difference, never similarity. But in this case, anger plays a very similar role in a worldwide sense. In many other religions, anger is mostly bad and unwholesome, but only in as much as it leads to harming others. Sometimes anger is viewed as positive or wholesome when it is righteous. This could be problematic. Who gets to say what is or isn't righteous? It could lead to a situation where righteous anger is regarded as such because it leads to the harm of, quote, those who deserve it. I would say Buddhism runs into this problem with Fudo Myo. He is thought of as being justified in killing or harming those who would harm the Buddha, Buddhism, or Buddhists. Do they deserve that? I don't really think so. It sounds a lot like smiting the infidels to me. However, on the other hand, worshipping a deity whose anger is so focused and pure and powerful that it basically atomizes any obstacles you may face to enlightenment and Buddhahood sounds awesome and totally justified. So I think it's hard to be sure about anger in Buddhism.
Based on my relatively shallow understanding from doing this show, I think I disagree. If Fudo Myo's rage is directed at people who want to harm Buddhists, he's acting defensively. He's being a protector. If those who are trying to harm Buddhists stopped, I would expect his anger to stop as well. It only takes one person wanting a fight for there to be a fight, and anger can be a part of stepping up to defend people around you. Aggressors can choose to relent, and that reduces the violence of the situation. If a protector chooses to relent, they are allowing violence to befall those who they were protecting. Ultimately, protectors have a harder job than aggressors.
I would agree with you if not for the fact that his anger is simultaneously directed at advancing people on the path, either through empowerment, which I think is fine, or through scaring them into it. I agree with your point when it comes to his role as solely a defender or a protector, but I don't think that scaring people into enlightenment is really the best situation. When I say that, I don't mean the type of scaring people to stop their hiccups. I mean by appearing before them and threatening them with damnation, pain, suffering, fire, and brimstone. In Vajrayana, some beings are regarded as not having the capacity to respond well to positive encouragement. They're only thought to respond well to threats and negative encouragement, i.e., do this or bad things will happen to you. That's not really the best way to encourage people to do something, in my opinion. The other point to consider has to do with real-life human beings, not doctrines, texts, ideas, or deities. No matter what anger's role in Buddhism is, it is something that Buddhists experience, continue to experience now, and will forever, regardless of doctrine, experience on a daily basis. Proclamations about its nature, its moral status, or its meaning will not change the fact of human experience. Using my modern, Western, post-Protestant, pacifistic morality, I can judge for myself whether individual people's anger or rage is justified, whether it was righteous, and whether or not it was moral, but that doesn't get me super far in a conversation about Buddhism. It really says more about me and the people I'm judging based on my values. Though Westerners and some Buddhists are resistant to accept this, people have committed atrocities in Buddhism's name, making few or no attempts to justify it to Buddhism itself. For example, there was the Mauryan Empire of Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. This was a nominally Buddhist empire after Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism, but he still did acts of horrible violence after conversion, such as torturing prisoners to death, ordering a massacre of 18,000 heretics for the misdeeds of one, and launching a pogrom against the Jains that even included his own brother. There were the standing armies of monasteries and temples in China and Japan that fought in wars and battles according to the political agendas and alliances of the head monks of those temples. There were the actions of some of the Japanese imperial military in the Asia-Pacific War, whose nominal purpose was to force the creation of a worldwide Lotus Sutra Buddhist empire with Japan and the Japanese people as the divine rulers. I think that anger played a huge role in all of these atrocities. You can't account for anger's role in Buddhism without dealing with these historical realities. One final point I want to mention is that we can't evaluate the role of anger and rage without discussing power and authority. Doctrine and history aside, many religions, Buddhism included, create a power dynamic where ordained people become spiritual authorities, and they purport to speak to non-ordained non-authorities with the weight of the divine. Thus, the reality is that regardless of doctrine or history, monastic people are given free rein to make situational judgments and proclamations with holy authority that others are just supposed to follow. This dynamic is potentially harmful in many, if not most, cases. This dynamic can elevate an individual's selfishly motivated feelings and inclinations to the level of a holy truth, and that power can go to a person's head and lead to abuse. In dealing with the question of anger and rage, powerful ordained figures could essentially make use of that anger or rage as an emotionally vulnerable moment, and then manipulate the individual to the interests of the religious group or the individual in question. I don't think we can ignore this power imbalance in lived religion either. So, it's a very difficult conclusion to come to.
And it's a very difficult conclusion to come to in most religions. Every other religion that I'm familiar with that has the power to have done that kind of mass level responses or declarations of doctrine, like they all have people within their histories who have done this exact kind of thing. This is a problem that extends far beyond Buddhism.
Exactly, I agree.
We hope you have enjoyed this week's discussion of rage and anger in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will discuss Brahmanical perspectives of Buddhism. What are some Brahmanical perspectives on Buddhism from the Buddha's lifetime or approximately thereabouts? What are the doctrinal roots of these perspectives? What is the historical relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism like?
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. If you like our show and you want to support us, we ask instead that you send that support to Black families that have been displaced by the LA wildfires. You can find a directory of GoFundMe pages for these families in the show notes. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.